Salud, and welcome to episode 5 of Health and Healing. In this episode, we are going to be shedding light on sunlight. I'm Dr. Hess, your host here, and this program is brought to you by the Scott Valley Seventh-day Adventist Church. Sunlight has gotten a bad rap in recent years, probably about the last 40 years. You've heard things like stay out of the sun, put on sunblock, and sunlight causes cancer. And these half-truths are ignoring the rest of the story and really giving the wrong impression about sunlight and the importance of sunlight. So in contrast to these modern sunlight phobics, many ancient cultures actually worshiped the sun. You've probably heard of that before. They believed that the sun was the source of life and brought all sorts of blessings to the earth. And while it is true that without the sun there would be no life on earth, the reality is that the sunshine, the sunlight, is just one avenue of the life-giving power of God for us here on earth. So today we want to find some of the truth that's somewhere between the two extremes on views of the sun. So I'm going to first make a recommendation for you about what you should actually do with regard to sun exposure. And then we're going to talk about some of the science that helps to explain why that's important. So everyone should get at least 30 minutes of sunlight, direct sunlight exposure on the face and large areas of skin. I say everyone, but there are some exceptions for people who have specific medical problems with sun exposure. But let me just modify that to say almost everyone should get at least 30 minutes a day of direct sunlight on the face and large areas of the skin. And it's important to have some of that exposure, that sun exposure, should be first thing in the morning when the sun is just coming up, to allow the sun to shine on your face is going to be very important. So let's talk about some of the reasons, some of the details, and the science about sun exposure and how it affects our bodies. Sunlight helps to stimulate the production of serotonin, production and release of serotonin in the brain. It also regulates the production and release of melatonin, as well as a number of other hormones in the body. And sunlight is vital to the production of vitamin D in our body. Of course, right now, at the time when I'm making this video, you're probably aware there's a global pandemic going on of an infectious disease. And it turns out there have actually been several studies looking at sunlight and the risk due to this pandemic. In one study that was done, they found that there was a significant correlation, inverse correlation of sun exposure and risk of complications or severe disease. And they did this by looking at different areas of the world, and they found that people who live closer to the equator, where there's more sun exposure naturally, had a lower risk. In another study, it was found that people who had higher levels of sun exposure recovered more quickly after they had been infected. And that is a significant problem for a lot of people who become infected. They have a long recovery time of just feeling tired and worn down, and it takes a long time to get their energy back. So it turns out sun exposure is going to be important in a speedy recovery. So what are some of the reasons for this? Well, first of all, you probably already know sunlight, ultraviolet sunlight, and ultraviolet radiation from other sources as well, but sunlight is the biggest one. Sunlight actually kills viruses. So the more sun is shining, the more virus is killed, the less virus there is to spread the infection. So that's a good reason to open your curtains, open your drapes, let the sunshine in to your home, your workspace, wherever you happen to be, or spend more time outdoors in the sunshine. Secondly, sun exposure, specifically sun exposure on the skin, is necessary for the production of vitamin D. It actually is part of the process, and I'm not going to go into the details of how it works, but basically our body takes cholesterol and turns it into vitamin D, and sunlight is part of that process. Now, vitamin D is really an important factor in a lot of things in our body, including the function of our immune system. And so there's been a number of studies that have shown people with a low vitamin D level are at higher risk for complications due to this infection. Of course, you can supplement your vitamin D intake by taking a pill, and while that's not exactly natural, it is relatively natural compared to a lot of other treatments that are out there. But as always, the most natural way is the best way, and the most natural way to boost your vitamin D level is direct sun exposure on large areas of skin. So getting sunlight will help you to increase your vitamin D level and improve your immune function, and it probably also helps to improve our immune function in other ways as well. It's just that vitamin D level has clearly been linked to sun exposure and reducing your risk. So I'll put the links to those studies in the description down below so you can read up more on that. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that sun exposure, and I'm talking about the sun shining into your eyes specifically, is important because that helps to regulate our circadian rhythms. So circadian basically just means around the day, circadia, or around the day, and our biologic clock keeps track of a lot of bodily functions and correlates them with the day and night cycle of the world. In order to keep our biologic clock tuned up, we need that sunlight exposure. So if you take a human being and you put them in a dark room for days at a time, their biologic clock or circadian rhythms will get out of sync with the actual day and night cycle. So it's kind of like I have this atomic clock here on my desk that resets itself continuously because it connects to an outside source that tells it the time, and so it stays up to date. Well, our outside source for our body clock is sunrise, that early morning sunlight. So get up, get out in the sun as early as possible in the day. Get that exposure, the sunlight shining into your face. I should say, I'm sure you all know this, but there are some people who might not. Don't stare directly at the sun. Okay, just get out in the sunshine, allow it to shine on your face without staring at the sun. And that does several things. First, it resets those circadian rhythms. It also, as part of that, it increases the serotonin level in the brain, which has been correlated with improving our mood. And so there's a couple of studies that have shown a direct correlation between increased sun exposure and decreased symptoms of depression, even in people who have serious health conditions. So again, there's a study on that. I'll put that link down below. Another reason that this is important is it actually improves the quality of our sleep. Now we're going to talk about sleep in a later episode, but just keep that in mind. Early morning sun exposure helps you sleep better later in the day. Pretty amazing. Finally, I want to talk about the myth that sun exposure is bad for you. And like I said at the beginning, it's been about 40 years of this constant messaging that you need to avoid the sun, put on sunblock, that the sun causes cancer and all sorts of things. In fact, it appears that there's a little grain of truth to that overall cumulative ultraviolet light exposure does increase your risk for basal cell and squamous cell skin cancers. The thing is that those two types of cancer are the most treatable cancers that we have. Simply, you cut them out, and that's it. They're cured. So they're unlike other types of cancers, which tend to spread and what we call metastasize and actually kill people. So the skin cancer that kills people is melanoma. And it turns out that your risk of dying from melanoma actually is decreased by total sun exposure. And the increase in the risk is sunburn, or what's called episodic high intensity UV exposure. So it's important to avoid sunburn. And what's the best way to avoid sunburn? Well, that is to have regular daily sun exposure so that maybe you tan a little bit, but you're not getting sunburned. There's been a number of studies on this, and in fact, I'm going to put a link down below to a review of studies looking at sun exposure and risk for all sorts of things. And what they found was when they compared people who got high sun exposure and people who avoided sun exposure, they found that the all-cause mortality, or the risk of dying, was actually doubled in the people who avoided sun exposure. So that is actually just the opposite of all the messaging that we hear. And the reality is God made the sun for our benefit. It's good to get sun exposure. Again, the caveat being if you have some sort of medical problem that is exacerbated by the sun, you need to discuss that with your doctor. But for most of us, we need more sun exposure, not less. And of course, avoid sunburn. That should be common sense. The best way to avoid sunburn is when you do get sun exposure, moderate that in small increments, build it up over time so that your body can adjust to that and enjoy. I don't know about you, but I know for myself, one of the things I really enjoy doing, springtime. Imagine this: it's springtime, it's a sunny day, you're laying on the grass, you're listening to the birds sing, there's little wispy clouds blowing overhead, and that sun just feels so good on your skin. And it is, in fact, good for you. So that's it for today. Our next episode is actually going to connect to this one just a little bit. In the next episode, we're going to talk about temperance, and I'll relate that back to sun exposure, and we're going to kind of dive a little bit into that. Maybe not exactly what you think, but hope that you will come back for that video. In fact, if you like these videos, please make sure that you like the videos and the app, subscribe, hit the notification button so you'll get notifications when our next episode is released, and share these videos with your friends so they too can be happy and healthy. And that's it for this episode. So until next time, my friends, be safe, be well, and God bless you.